We should do the intro. I suppose that's the first question. Got to start somewhere.
I guess we didn't work all that out yet.
Didn't work that out. It's fine. It's all right.
All right, so this is episode 1 of Under the Radar. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith.
You may know our other podcasts. David has been doing Developing Perspective for many years. I did Build and Analyze first. Now I do the Accidental Tech podcast and Top 4. And this is going to be a show about development, basically. It's kind of like the sequel, the combination of Build and Analyze with Developing Perspective. And in the spirit of Developing Perspective never being longer than 15 minutes, David, how long is this show going to be?
Never longer than 30 minutes.
So let's get started.
Let's get started. I think the place to start seems right now we're recording just after the Apple TV App Store launched. And it went online, I think, on last Friday, and it's had the usual fanfare and the things that go on with that, but neither one of us launched anything on day one. And I know for myself, it's the first Apple product I've ever not been in the store on day one for, which is interesting.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I think. I mean, I was there for the watch and the Apple TV, and I even got one of the early access developer units because I thought I might use it, and it just literally sat on my desk, and I was so busy doing other things because I was working on Overcast and trying to get the 2.0 update out the door, and that kind of precluded this because if I'm going to make an Apple TV app, it has to be all about streaming because local storage with the Apple TV is so limited, and I didn't have the streaming engine done yet, so I worked on the iPhone app first, and I've been doing bug fixes on that since, and I have literally not even opened like an Xcode project with the TV. I haven't even seen the TV simulator. I have not written a single line of TV code yet. Have you?
Yeah, I got a developer kit as well, and I wrote a version of Pod Wrangler, my podcast client, for the Apple TV, and it works and it plays. I didn't spend the time and energy to get it ready for day one though, but it's like it's an interesting developer platform because it is essentially iOS, just minus a bunch of stuff. Like there's a couple of new things, but essentially it's just iOS UI kits with a different input mechanism rather than obviously being touch based. It's remote control based. But I used it and it's fine and easy. The thing that ultimately I think slowed me down though is I just became like there's just so much else to do and so many other things that like if I'm trying to be on every Apple platform as a one-man shop, it's essentially impossible now. And so I looked at the Apple TV and I'm like, it's going to be a long time before there's a big market there. And so I just didn't prioritize it.
Yeah, and I feel like we're coming at this from two different viewpoints here. I tend to work on usually one app for a span of years. I very rarely have additional apps. I'm not very good at splitting my time between multiple apps. I pretty much just do one thing, and I try to make that one app big and complicated and appeal to a ton of people in order to keep it going. Whereas the background you come from is I think much more interesting, honestly, because when people, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to do the show with you, and one of the reasons I wanted to call it Under the Radar, because when people think about Apple developers, they tend to think about the handful of well-known ones who make mass consumer apps that you may have heard of. So apps like Tweetbot or NetNewsWire, or the apps from Panic that a lot of developers have heard of or use or are wowed by. And there's this massive number of developers who we don't usually hear about in the circle of like Apple enthusiasts and tech bloggers and stuff. And I think you are a very, very good example of this massive market, and I think you do it better than most people would do it. And so what you do is not like the high profile, high attention Mac blogger, long-term ecosystem kind of thing. You do something way more pragmatic. And so can you maybe just go into that briefly for anyone who doesn't know you yet, who's listening to this for some reason? Can you go into like what exactly you do and how you got there?
So I've been an iOS developer essentially since the App Store started about 7 and a bit years ago. I didn't quite make the day one of the App Store, mostly because of like business approval stuff. But I've been developing ever since then. And since then, I've launched think I recently worked this out, something like 52 unique app concepts in the last 7 years. So it works out to be about one every 2 months or so. It hasn't been exactly that even of a pace, but that's roughly the average. But I've been making a good, steady, comfortable living from it for about 6.5 of those 7 years. And so I have lots of different products in a lot of different areas. I tend to, like at this point, I have probably 5 or 6 that are like my main income makers, and they each, the biggest one of them only makes up a third of my income. So it's a very diversified type of thing. And that's the approach that I found that works well for me, is to make lots of small bets and see which one pays off in the store, rather than trying to take the approach like with Overcast. If I remember right, it's like you spend 18 months working on it. Yeah. As like a big major focus. And like for me, the longest I've ever spent on a product before I launched it is probably 4 weeks or something along those lines. And so it's a very different kind of a focus, where I'll put something together, I'll put it out in the store, I try and make it like good in quality, but very straightforward, and see what happens. And that approach means that I end up now with lots of different products doing a lot of different things. And I have the benefit of diversity in terms of stability, but the difficulty in terms of keeping up with things when I have such a wide, sort of portfolio to manage.
And one thing I like about the way you work as well is that you challenge assumptions that many of us in like the other half of this community don't challenge. Like you make your income in part from iAd. I don't know anybody else. I don't think I have any other developer friends who have a meaningful presence using iAds, and you do. And you will challenge assumptions based on things like monetization, support, app concepts, all design, like all sorts of stuff that you challenge. And I think you benefit from that, because while everyone else is locked into this one way of thinking and trying to shape the App Store into like trying to educate consumers into the way they think the App Store should be, you are out there actually adapting and thriving in what the App Store actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I try and think of when I look at the App Store, or I guess at business in general, like I can't change my customers. All I can do is react to them for the most part. Like using things like people should want to pay for software as like a statement, like doesn't make any sense to me. Like people are going to want to do whatever they want to do. And like my job as a developer, as a businessman, is to look at the market that I want to work in and find ways to adapt my business to it. And I don't just use iAd or advertising. Like I make the majority of my income from advertising in iAd. And that's been in some ways been far more stable than any of the more paid or subscription or patronage or all the other things that I have. Like the most stable income I get is from advertising. And I love it because advertising is great because it aligns developer and customer like goals. Like my goal is to get them using the app as much as I can, because the more they use it, the more advertising income I make. And from, if they're using the app a lot, that means they like it. And so for me, it was a no-brainer to get started, but it definitely is. I know what you mean. Like it's a bit counter to, I think, a lot of the, it's not necessarily pretentiousness, but there's definitely that air of like you want to sell an Apple-like product in the App Store, but that doesn't necessarily work because Apple doesn't even sell Apple-like products in the App Store.
Yeah, and I think this was all like, I think this was all rooted in the community of like kind of like nice craft Mac independent developers that has existed for quite some time on the Mac before iOS and everything became really so big. People like Panic or Delicious Monster, people like that, Brent Simmons, Dave Watanabe. Like there's this crowd of like kind of old school, the old guard, who have been around for a while. Omni Group is a big one, who have been very successful at this, and many of them continue to be very successful at this. But there was this idea for so long that many people still hold that would translate into iOS, and that also any developer who would be able to program iOS apps would kind of think that they deserved that same level of success if they just if they either just got there at all, or if they put a lot of work into something. And there's many problems with this that are way too long to discuss in a 30-minute podcast. One of which is that that the amount of work you put into something does not correlate to the value that the market will place on it, or the amount of money you can make from it. But I think it's productive to challenge this notion of like, well, is this really the way the world should work? And regardless of whether I think it should work this way, if this is not the way the world works, like in practice, what can I do as a developer to succeed in this market? And sitting around waiting for the market to change to benefit you is probably not very productive, because that's just unlikely to happen.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I was wondering what you think about this, because I'm seeing the spread of your app career in the App Store. Like you're starting in Instapaper, which was paid up front $10, if I remember right.
Yeah, the whole first year it was $10, and I dropped it to $5. Yeah,
and then it's like following the progression. Then I think your income started to shift in some ways more to subscription and in-app purchase, and then switching entirely to Overcast, where it was free with in-app purchase for features, and then now it's entirely free with like patronage support.
Mm-hmm.
You've essentially followed the trajectory of the App Store in that way, right? You're starting with like the old school kind of, well, it's premium software, I should charge a lot of money, to it's still good software, but the way you pay for it is completely different.
Right. And most of that has, again, just been because I'm not like thinking I'm like, treading new ground and being an explorer. No, I'm usually coming to these changes late, actually. Like Instapaper, holding the price at $10 for the whole first year was a mistake. When I dropped it to $5, sales went up considerably. And then, later on, it dropped to $3, I think I held it for a while, $3 or $4. And then, and sales were pretty good then. I started experimenting, and then shifting to subscription. That ended up making way more money than I thought it would, and doing very well. And then with Overcast coming out at free, with in-app purchase, and now with patronage, like those have all done better than I expected them to. And this is all about just adapting to what the market is. Many people blame the market on Apple not implementing upgrade pricing, or the App Store not having good enough discovery or search, and all of those things are valid complaints, but they're not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is there's just a huge oversupply of developers and apps who are all trying to compete for the same dollars and the same roles and the same time and attention. And so, back in the olden days, when you'd have like Panic and Omni selling Mac apps for $50, that worked in part because of what they were and what people use Macs for and who was buying Macs, but also that worked in part because there just weren't that many developers doing it. If you would have had 10,000 developers trying to make the same handful of nice consumer high-profile Mac apps, you would have had the exact same problem back then. It isn't that the market has like gotten stupider or cheaper or anything like that. It's that this is now the mass market of what developers do. It wasn't. Back in 2006, most developers weren't working on Mac apps. Now, most developers are working on iOS and web apps, and I think the shift from web to iOS apps is really pretty significant. And so, if you think about just that's what so many developers are working on, of course there's going to be a massive oversupply, and of course there's going to be tons of competition and a race to the bottom in pricing. And that's not because Apple is doing something wrong. Apple is not helping in certain ways, but they're not the cause of this problem. And, again, pragmatically, it is useful to think of yourself not as somebody who all you need to do is ship a nicely designed, polished app and money will start flowing in, but as somebody who has to really fight, really work hard and fight hard and be lean to try to attract any kind of attention and any kind of money from what is a very crowded, hyper-competitive market.
And I think it's also the biggest trap that I know I struggled with for years was this feeling of overvaluing my own work. That if I spent a long time working on something, that everybody should then sort of it should somehow intrinsically that makes it more valuable to people.
Right.
That they look at something and it's like, whereas when like when people are going to part with money in whatever form that is, like whether that's or I guess part with something, like their attention, their money, they're exchanging something for that. Like they need to feel like they're getting something in return. And the funny thing is, I think a lot of people think that software intrinsically should feel valuable, like as though like the classic, they'll spend $5 on a latte, but they won't spend $5 on my app. And it's like, well, maybe they actually want the latte more than they want your app. Like your app may not actually be that valuable to them. And that's why they don't want to spend that money on it. Like you have to be able to wrap your arms around what they're actually buying with that. Like, is it entertainment? Is it productivity? Is it amusement? Are they exchanging goodwill for money? Like things like when you start to get into, like I know I have an app with a tip jar in it, or you have patronage in Overcast now. Like your extent there, you're providing a mechanism for people to exchange goodwill for money is really what you're doing there. And unless you're able to really wrap your arms around that, it's hard to really like be okay with saying like that's okay. Like I do advertising because for a lot of my apps, like the app itself isn't particularly valuable to the person. It's useful, but it's not necessarily valuable in a way that for a lot of people they would want to put money into it directly. Once they use it for a while and like it, they are willing to spend money, but they're not spending money for the functionality. They're spending money to be able to express the goodwill they have towards me for the benefit I've given them. But that's different than it being intrinsically valuable to them. Because when they started, they didn't see it as valuable. They wanted it to be free. And if it wasn't free, I don't think, like my pedometer app, Pedometer Plus Plus, wouldn't have sold at all, or at least not in large quantity that it has, to this point.
Yeah, and even as a consumer of apps now, I find myself, even as somebody who has been a proponent of paid apps for so long and sold one for so long, when I search for something in the App Store and I see the search results list, if I need something that I'm not looking for a specific name, where I'm just looking for a specific type of app, so a pedometer or a step count or whatever, if I search the App Store and the first 20 entries in the search are all free, and entry number 21 is $4, that one doesn't stand a chance.
Yeah,
like that's just the reality of how people search the App Store, and it's very important, as you said, like to recognize that, and to recognize that not every app that every developer makes is going to be worth a non-trivial number of customers spending $2 on it or whatever. I've seen so many apps that do things that I don't really need. Like so many apps that are things like coffee timers. Well, if a coffee timer is really good and it's free, I might use it, or I can just use the built-in timer on the device that's not as good, but it works. And I think a lot of people go through a similar kind of thought process of, if free is such a different barrier than any price, and if you're looking at an app, the alternative isn't just every other app that's in the store that does that same thing. The alternative is also just non-consumption. It's not buying the app at all, not buying any app, and just going without that role in your life. And as we get more and more and more apps in the store, which is only, that's been going on forever now, as we get more and more apps in the store and more demands for people's attention and more alternatives that they can do, like if they don't download your app, they can go check Twitter for a few minutes or play a game. And as we get more and more of those things, more and more competition for everything, non-consumption is also a big problem. And so anything you can do to address non-consumption, to address people just bailing out and abandoning this search or this idea they might have had, this thing they wanted to do, and going free is a huge hit against that. Like if you can remove that barrier of price up front, then it's so much easier for people to say, you know what, yeah, I'll give it a try.
And I guess the reality is that's how I think we've both been able to continue in the App Store at this point. I mean, we've been doing it for a long time. Because anecdotally, it seems like fewer and fewer smaller or more independent companies where people are able to do it. And I do think a lot of it is that it's a lack of pragmatism, that a lack of just like, what is it going to take to make a living in this market? And if you ultimately don't like the answer to that, if you're in your mind, you only want to sell software in a premium app store, it's like, okay, well, you might need to do something else then, because that may not exist.
Yeah, and you need to be in the right place at the right time if you want that. If you will not budge on that, like so right now. So getting back for a second to the Apple TV, which just came out now. The Apple TV App Store has almost nothing in it. It is very, very sparse. And if you are looking for something so I got this Apple TV, I plugged it in, set it up, and I went right to the App Store to see, hey, what can I get here? And I saw a couple of basics, Netflix, HBO Now, whatever. And then, okay, let me try some games. I got this cool thing. I'm in the mood of trying new things. Let me go to the App Store and try some games. And I went and I spent, I don't know, $10 maybe total on a couple of games. And I didn't even think about it because I'm in this buying mood because I just got this new device. It's brand new, has me excited. And also, there's hardly anything there to buy. And of the very small number of games there were there to buy, almost all of them, I think, were paid, or at least many of them were. So I had no problem spending that money because of the context of this isn't a tremendous app store filled with millions of apps, most of which are free. This is a very, very small app store that right now that has only very few apps on it. And that's the reason I was able to charge $10 for Instapaper in 2008. But then I couldn't in 2009 because the App Store was too full. That's going to happen with the Apple TV also. If this thing takes off, if this succeeds, and it looks like it's probably going to. I mean, it might take a few years before it has like tons and tons of units out there, but it's probably going to succeed. And if that happens, or as that happens, the App Store is going to be way more crowded than it is now, and it is going to get harder and harder to sell games and apps for the Apple TV for money once there is competition for that same role in people's lives. And so if you were going to be the kind of person who wanted to sell a premium app for money, you just had a window to do that on the Apple TV. Almost no one has taken up that opportunity, but you just had that opportunity right now, and it won't come again on the Apple TV probably ever. This product has now done that. And it probably won't come again.
Yeah.
And so you have to wait till the next big wave. And you have to be in one of those positions where if you're not going to be if you're not going to be the kind of person who can thrive in an ultra-competitive, low-priced environment like the web has pretty much always been and like the iOS App Store is now, then you have to follow the trend and be early to things, be there on day one when new things happen, be able to figure out and guess which new things will take off, which is a hugely risky process that you will often get wrong and it will often go completely to waste, and be there in those less competitive markets. But then as soon as the market becomes more competitive, you have to either adapt or leave.
Yeah, and I think the difficulty, honestly, with Apple TV and why I think I agree that like the best time to have sold big software would have been like if being there on day one. My suspicion is the narrowness of the window where there's going to have that kind of general rush and people being okay with buying things is narrow enough that I'm very skeptical if it would actually be financially successful for most people. That if they had spent a lot of time, made a nice big premium game or something like that, especially designed specifically for the Apple TV, the window in which they were going to be able to sell into a kind of a premium group of people, like people who obviously were excited enough about the product to get it on day one. They're very, they've just spent in Apple terms, a relatively small amount of money for it. They're not nearly as expensive as a lot of the other products that, like an iPhone's $700 or something, whereas this is $100 and something or $200. And so that window is going to be very narrow. And so if your app requires that you then have big sustained sales over the next few months, my suspicion is that's going to be a losing proposition. And so that's interesting. And it's the Apple TV, I think, will be a nice, sort of in many ways like the watch. It's just an add-on to the main product that Apple sells, which is the iPhone. It's like the iPad in many ways, the watch, now the Apple TV. These are all just add-ons to the iOS ecosystem that exists for the iPhone.
Yeah, and I think the value that you can get out of being there, I think you make a very good point about that window being fairly narrow. I think how narrow it is depends on how easy it is to develop for it and how many people realize how quickly they need to be developing for it or they want to be developing for it. So with the iPhone, that was very, very quick, really, because the iPhone already had a massive installed base. There was tons of pent-up demand to develop for it, and people knock the doors down to get there. Most platforms don't work that way. The watch, I think, has kind of fizzled out. The watch, I think, is kind of at a standstill right now. I don't know of any really interesting stuff that's happened on the watch in the last month, say. It seems like not a lot is going on there, and we'll talk about that in future episodes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And the TV is now out, but it's starting from an installed base of 0 for a product that people are excited about, but not so excited that they're going to go out and like raid all the stores and deplete all the stock on day one. So that's going to have a slower buildup. And so if that buildup is slower also on the developer supply side, where fewer developers are jumping in so soon, so quickly, then I think you do have a wider window. Like, I would say the biggest sales day for Apple TV apps this year is going to be the day after Christmas. And if you are there, I think you can still sell a nice $10 game the day after Christmas in big volumes this year, but probably not next year.
We'll see. Yeah, I would say I'm more on the skeptical side of that, but I think you're right insofar as that's a reasonable. It's going to the next few months will be interesting for it, and I think the Apple TV. I will ultimately develop for it though, and which is probably a good place to wrap up. Is to say, like, I expect to make apps for it, mostly because having a nicely rich, it's a checkbox that I can check for some of my applications to say, like, make them just that little bit more appealing to somebody. If someone was on the fence about downloading my app and they're like, oh, it'll work for the Apple TV, awesome. Then it's like that little thing, but it's not a priority for me insofar as I don't think it's going to ever be a primary driver for my business. It's like same as the watch. I make watch apps for a lot of my apps, mostly just so that it's like if for the narrow group of people where that's all they needed to go over the edge, then it was worthwhile for me. But in and of itself, it's probably not.
Yeah, and that could be a whole episode right there. And I totally agree with everything you just said. That I expect to launch Xcode for the first time to make an Apple TV app probably this week. I'd like to see how easy it is to get Overcast to run on it. But again, it's kind of a value add, to use a business term. I'm sorry. It's kind of that for Overcast on iOS in general, rather than like I don't expect to make a lot of money on the Apple TV by itself. But anyway, we are running out of time this week, so we want to keep the show nice and short so people can listen to it quickly and don't feel overloaded by it. So let's wrap it up this week. David, thank you, I guess. I don't know. We've never done an ending before, and we don't have a song. So what are we going to do? Just stop?
Probably just stop.
All right. Thanks for listening, whoever's listening to this, and hopefully we will see you again for the next episode.
Yep. See you under the radar.